Chapter 8. Not long after the radio report, my mother came home again with very little flour for supper, and that night all we had was a taste. As I sat on the floor to eat, I looked down the corridor and saw Khamba standing at the open door. He was looking bad, with his head hung low and his eyes drooping. His ribs were like blades against his skin. The walk across the courtyard exhausted him. He was starving to death. The last big meal he'd eaten was our Christmas goat skin. That food had given him a bit of strength and even added some weight to his frame. But there had been little since. I counted how many times I'd fed Khamba in the past 2 weeks. Just handfuls of sema, nothing more. And stopped at 5. I didn't have to think very hard. That number was all I ever thought about, and seeing him standing there was like a hammer in my stomach. I had nothing to give him tonight. "Sorry, friend," I said, "I just can't share." It didn't take me long to eat. When the food was gone and out of sight, I stood up and made my way down the corridor. Stepping over the dog, I walked back to my room, closed the door, and got in bed. The next morning, the hunger woke me up. Little did I know, but my stomach had taken over my entire body, filled every limb and crevice, all the way up to my head like a great big balloon. At some point in the early morning, it had finally burst and revealed its emptiness. It had only been filled with air, and in this nothingness there was only pain. I took deep breaths to try to fill the space again, but it was no use. I was flattened like a tube. It hurt so badly. I lay in bed and listened to the rain pound my ceiling steadily through the grass thatch and plastic sheeting below. Somewhere in the dark, it dripped and dripped. I have to eat, I thought. I lay there until the sun sent a gray beam through my shuttered window. When I no longer heard raindrops hitting the roof, I gathered the strength to sit up. I got out of bed and pulled on my clothes, grabbed a few things, then made my way outside. I stopped at the door of the kitchen and peeked in. Khamba was curled up near the fire pit, which had long lost its heat. I couldn't tell if he was breathing. I wondered if we'd had the same dream. "Khamba," I shouted, "let's go hunting." The very words were like a bolt of current through his body. Khamba jerked his head up and slapped his tail once again against the floor. It had been a year since I'd said those words. Despite his weakness, he struggled to his feet. His legs trembled from arthritis, but his tail swung like mad. He was ready. "Let's go get some food." I had no maize or gaga to set my trap, so I grabbed a handful of ash from my mother's fire and threw it into a sugar bag. The dog and I then walked outside towards the Dawa Highlands, which seemed forever draped in turmoil. The rains would never end. The walk took twice as long, with Khamba limping slowly behind. I stayed just a few steps ahead, whistling a tune to try to raise my spirits. The maize in the fields was growing tall and green, and I knew it wouldn't be long until we ended this torment. Maybe a month, perhaps a bit longer. I scanned the sky for birds, but saw none. At the trap site, I fashioned my rubber pole, stretched it back, and set the trigger. I sprinkled the ash into the kill zone. It looked pathetic. "Let's hope this works," I said. If we could get 3 birds, perhaps tonight I could sleep. Perhaps Khamba could get better and hold on, just for another month. I looked I took the rope and dragged it 20 yards behind the thombozi tree. Khamba collapsed with a thud, then nearly fell asleep. I stretched out on my stomach and waited. About 15 minutes later, a small flock of about 5 birds swooped down and landed outside the trap. Khamba's head shot up, as if he'd seen it in a dream. As the birds were nearing the kill zone, my imagination began to wander. In slow motion, I saw the rubber smash the birds against the bricks, crushing them instantly. I saw myself plucking the feathers. I pulled off the heads. I took my knife from my waist and made an incision just below the breast, then scooped out the entrails. I tossed the bloody bits into the air, and Khamba snatched them in his jaws. I laughed and praised him, but I couldn't make out the words. After that, I rinsed my hands with water from the dambo, getting off all the blood then rinsed the birds clean. I then sprinkled the warm flesh with salt and rubbed it into the skin so it was sure to stay. I started a small fire behind the tree, which quickly dried to a glowing beam of embers. I split the back sides and laid the bird's breast directly on the coals and heard the meat begin to sizzle. Soon the smell of roasting flesh was all around me, encompassing the entire universe. It tickled the back of my brain. I flipped them over, salivating. Then suddenly, the sudden pounding of my heart snapped me out of the spell just in time to see the birds hop towards the trap. Khamba sat rigid and watching, lost in his own delicious daydreams. I gripped the rope, muscles twitching. But as soon as the birds stepped into the kill zone, they realized the bait was only ash and quickly flew away in a burst of wings. I exhaled in defeat and dropped the vine, too exhausted to move. I may have even cried. That night at home, Kama curled up outside my door and fell into a deep, almost frightening sleep. The hunt had taken nearly everything from him. At supper, I saved half a handful of sema plus some pumpkin leaves and walked outside to where he lay. Kamba, I shouted, supper! It was another word he knew. He opened his eyes and slapped his tail. I tossed the food above his head, but he made no effort. The sema and pumpkin leaves hit the ground with a thud. Almost as an afterthought, Kamba picked himself up and ate. 2 days later, I fed him again. It was only a bit of pumpkin leaves, so I walked out and put them in his food bowl. He saw me and limped over, but as soon as the pumpkin leaves hit his stomach, he vomited them right up. I knew the end was near. Just wait 1 month, I said, pleading. We'll be feasting in a month. The following evening, he vomited his food again. Nothing worked. The next morning, Charity and Mizek walked over to my house on their way to the trading center. I hadn't seen Mizek since we'd feasted on my birds at the clubhouse. He'd once been a fat guy. Now he was hardly anything left. I could see the skull in his face. When he saw Kamba, his voice got a bit crazy. Look at this thing, he said, standing over Kamba. He looks pathetic. Kamba was half asleep, his skin and bones now covered in flies. He'd stopped even caring. Can't even stand to look at it, Mizek said. Then don't, I thought, but said nothing. What did he care about my dog? I tried to change the subject. So what are you chaps doing today? I asked. Going to the trading center as usual, said Charity, looking for some ganyu, but I'm not so hopeful. As Charity and I chatted, Mizek remained quiet. He was still staring at Kamba, not even blinking his eyes. Why don't you put this thing out of his misery, he said. Take it behind the house with a big stone. I pretended not to hear. He's right, William, Charity said. You need to do something. Take him to the Dambo. The water is high. This dog is too weak to swim. Wait a minute, guys, I said. What are you saying? We're saying it's time to be a man, said Mizek. It's time to kill this pathetic animal. I wanted to smash his face. Guys, Kamba is fine, I said, my voice growing weaker. Listen, said Mizek. If you can't be a man and do it yourself, we'll do it for you. This thing is making me sick. It's the right thing to do, said Charity, lowering his voice. You won't even have to bother. We'll stop by tomorrow and take him. He won't feel a thing. I struggled for words, some form of protest, but was stopped short. Mizek now glared at me, his eyes wild. It's not your decision, he said. When Mizek and Charity left, I felt dizzy and weak, as if my legs were made of grass. I stood there watching Kamba sleep, then managed to sit down beside him. The flies were thick on his coat, circling and landing, circling and landing. After half an hour, he finally opened his eyes and caught me staring, then gave me a slow slap of his tail. The way he looked at me, even like this, made me remember our days hunting, how we could talk to each other without even speaking. How would I protect my dog if Mizek and Charity returned? I couldn't let them take him. I thought about the many ways of doing this until the compound grew dark, then finally realized my answer. They'd been right. Kamba was suffering, even miserable, but they'd been wrong about me. The next morning I was back outside watching Kamba sleep when Charity appeared in the courtyard. My heart began to pound. He looked at my dog and cocked his chin. Before he could say anything, I stood up. I'm taking him, I said. What? I'm taking him to the forest. He shrugged. A stone is very quick, he said. This is what I want. Charity nodded his head. You're making the right decision. We'll do it together, today. Today, I said. That afternoon, when Charity returned, we walked to the shady area outside my room. Khamba still lay there, unmoved. Then I pretended I was someone else, and so I was. Khamba, I said, let's go hunting. His head perked up. I said, let's go. He stumbled to his feet, shook once to get the flies off his back, and hobbled towards me. It took us ages to get out of the compound. I walked backward slightly ahead of Khamba, making sure to never take my eyes off him. Come on, boy, you can do it. We walked down the road towards the highlands. The sun was low in the west and colored the hills in an orange glow. The air was warm and dry, a perfect weather to hunt. We entered the blue gum groves that reached just below our heads, the bush that Khamba knew so well. At one point, Charity turned. This way, he said. My heart dipped into my stomach. Khamba followed, struggling to walk over the high grass and the sticks. Come on, Khamba, I said. I could feel the tears hot in my throat, but I swallowed them down. Charity turned to me. Don't be so upset, he said. It's just a dog. Yeah, I said. Just a dog. After several minutes, we stopped in a thick bush, surrounded in chest-high grass. The mountains were visible in the distance through the blue gums. This is a good place, Charity said. No one will pass here. I looked around. I could still see my house. This is too close, I said. The dog can't go any farther. Khamba had already flopped down under a thombozi tree and was panting heavily. Without my saying anything, Charity began stripping the bark off of a few sanga trees to make a long rope, then doubled them together to make it strong. I turned my back and stared into the trees. At one point, Charity's hands went quiet, but I didn't look. Tie him to the tree, I said. Charity lashed the rope around the trunk of the thombozi tree, then tied the other end around Khamba's front leg. When I got the courage to turn around, I saw my dog lying in the tall, bent grass. His ribs jutted out of his side. He was panting, weak. Without saying anything, Charity turned and walked away. When I followed, Khamba lifted his head and began to cry. His body was too weak to make any real noise, just a panicked whine that came from deep within. He knew I was leaving him. After a few steps down the trail, I made the mistake of turning back around. His eyes were still on me. Then he laid down his head. I did a terrible thing, I whispered, walking faster. I was going to vomit. He was old, Charity said. He was going to die anyway. I did a terrible thing. Once we reached the compound, Charity went to the clubhouse, and I walked towards my room. On the way, my eyes caught sight of Khamba's food bowl lying by the hen house. I ran over, picked it up, and hurled it against the ground, shattering it into pieces. It's just a dog, I thought. That night, I stayed awake long into the night, knowing Khamba was just down the hill. If I screamed loud enough into the dark, he would probably hear me. The next day, I avoided most people and tried to stay in the fields. But once I got home, my Uncle Socrates was coming out of my house, having visited my father. Where's Khamba? He said. I can't find him anywhere. I haven't seen him, I said. I was wondering the same thing. He said. I hope those wild dogs didn't get him. I'm sure we'll smell him soon enough if they did. I felt nauseous all day. That night I tried to force Khamba out of my mind, thinking of anything but him. It wasn't difficult. I was so hungry that I couldn't concentrate on one thing too long anyway. The next morning, Charity stopped by and found me in my room. "Let's go see what happened to Khamba," he said. He was in good spirits. "What do you mean?" "Let's go see if he's dead." I said nothing. "We'll bring some hose so people think we're going to the fields," he said. "That way we can also bury him." We set off down the trail carrying hose. I was too mixed up inside for conversation. We turned off the road and into the bush. The grass was still wet with dew and soaked my trousers. At some point, I saw a white hump on the ground. We continued. "Is he dead?" Charity asked. Getting closer, I had a clear view. Kamba was laying in the same position as I'd left him. His head was down, resting on his front paws, and his eyes were wide open. I gasped, expecting him to move. But as I got closer, I saw his tongue was sticking out. It was dry, like paper. A trail of ants moved in and out of his open mouth. "Kamba is dead," I said. The rope hadn't budged. There'd been no struggle. A terrible thought suddenly occurred to me. When Kamba saw me leave, he'd given up his will to live. That meant I killed him. While Charity untied the rope from the tree, I dug a pit with my hoe, my mind blank and black inside. A vigorous energy came rushing upward from that cold, dark place. It was the hardest I'd worked in months. The rope was still attached to Kamba's leg, so I pulled while Charity pushed with the hoe. With a bit of effort, Kamba toppled into the shallow pit. "So long, Kamba," I said. "You were a good friend." We filled the hole with soil and left no marker, even concealed the patch with grass and branches. When Charity and I got home, we told no one about what we'd done. Even after all these years, it remained a secret. Until now. 2 weeks after burying my dog, cholera swept the district. The epidemic had started in November with the southern region near Mwanza. A farmer from that area traveled to a funeral in Kasia, 20 kilometers from Wimbe, and brought the sickness with him. Within days, a dozen were dead in that village, and hundreds were infected across the district. Cholera is a terrible way to die. It begins with a horrible stomach ache, nausea, and instant weakness. Violent diarrhea then follows, milky and colorless and without any smell. It drains the body of life and energy, leaving a person so weak he can't even speak. Without treatment, death comes in 6 hours. Across Malawi and the rest of Africa, cholera is an unfortunate companion of the rainy seasons. Many villagers have poorly built pit latrines, which sometimes flood and pollute the streams and wells where people drink. The blowflies also carry the bacteria after crawling out of latrines and landing on food. And during the famine, people looking for something to eat also became carriers. The cholera would strike them on the road, forcing them to become sick in the bush. Rain, flies, and cockroaches then spread the disease, contaminating the banana peels, tubers, and husks people picked up from the ground to eat. To keep us safe, the clinic and the training center began giving out free chlorine to treat our drinking water. My mother brought it home one afternoon in a Coca-Cola bottle, and for the rest of the month, our water tasted like metal. We also covered the latrine hole with a broom handle and flat piece of tin as advised. But once you stepped inside and pulled off the lid, the flies swarmed from the hole like the great plagues of the Bible, smashing into your face and mouth around your head. It became quite stressful, swatting them and trying to finish your business at the same time. Any traces of diarrhea found in the latrine hole would always cause alarm. Each day the cholera people walked past our house on their way for treatment, their eyes milky and skin wrinkled from dehydration. I'd watch them from behind the trees until they got close, then run down the trail towards home. But just as they left, the starving people would follow. Those who died from cholera were soaked in chlorine and buried at night in the graveyard by the Catholic Church, usually by the same doctors and staff who treated them. To speed the process, two bodies would be placed in the same shallow hole, then quickly covered. No one knows how many were dying across Wimbe. Between hunger and cholera, there were burials every day. Back at home, Jeffrey's anemia had grown worse. His legs became horribly swollen, and if you touched his feet, your finger left an impression in his bubbled skin, as if his legs were filled with clay. "Can you feel it?" I'd ask, poking the blisters. "I can't," he said. He was often dizzy and had trouble walking straight lines. One afternoon, I took him outside into the sunshine, but he stopped and said, "Wait, I can't see." We had to stand there until his eyes adjusted to the light. For months now, his mother had only served pumpkin leaves at supper. My cousin was slowly dying. With little else to do, my mother took half of our flour for the day, placed it in a basin, and walked it over to Jeffrey's house. "I've come to share this with you," my mother said. "It's not much, but it's enough for porridge." "Thank you so much," said Jeffrey's mom. "You've saved our very lives." "We share what we have," my mother said. "We can't allow our family to suffer." A few days later, my father's sister Chrissy came by and said my grandpa had fainted in his yard. "He's only eating pumpkin leaves," she said. "Brother, please pray for our father." That afternoon, my mother took half our food again and gave it to Grandpa. We were all losing weight. The bones began to show in my chest, and the rope I'd used as a belt no longer sufficed. Now, I'd started pinching my two belt loops together, then tying them off with a stick, much like a tourniquet, which I could simply twist when I became thinner. My mouth was always dry. My arms became thin, like blue gum poles, and ached all the time. Soon I found it difficult to squeeze my hand into a fist. One afternoon I was pulling weeds in the fields when my heart began beating so fast that I lost my breath and nearly fainted. What's wrong with me? I thought. I was so frightened. I bent down slowly until my knees were in the soil, and then I stayed that way for a long time until my heart returned to normal and I could breathe. At night, I sat in my room with the lamp and stared into the walls, dozing off, passing through some other world. I watched a centipede crawl up the wall for what seemed like hours. I grabbed a mayfly by the wings that had flown too close to the flame, asking it, "How are you alive? What are you eating?" and then let it go, watching it spiral towards the ground like a broken paper airplane. No magic could save us now. Starving was a cruel kind of science. Around this time, my father started weighing himself obsessively. By now, his mighty frame had shrunk like a piece of fruit in the sun. Sharp bones poked through where giant muscles once dominated. His teeth seemed bigger. I noticed his scars. One day, he told me he was having trouble seeing across the compound. Like Jeffrey, the hunger had taken his vision. It seemed the thinner my father became, the more he wanted to weigh himself. He kept a maize scale hanging by a rope from the tobacco shelter, and one morning I watched his routine. He gripped the hook, then hung there like a sack of maize or a bale of tobacco, staring up at the needle. He then made a grunting sound and said, 5 kilos. Mama? As always, my mother came and looked, but she refused to weigh herself. The children were also forbidden. Like many women during the hunger, she'd started tying her impango tight around her waist like a belt. She said it confused her stomach and tricked her heart from beating so fast, helping her breathe. When she nursed my baby sister in the mornings and afternoons, her hands would shake. At night, she resorted to mind games. You're losing weight because you keep thinking about food, she'd tell my sisters. Do you know what causes your body to stress and burn more energy? If hunger is all you think about, you'll only suffer more. I don't want to become swollen, Mama, my sisters cried. Then think about positive things. Please do that for me. Then she'd serve our sema, and we'd pass through it like a dream, our three mouthfuls of food leaving no trace in our bodies. My father then started excusing himself once the food was served. Papa, aren't you going to eat? No, I'm fine. You kids go ahead. One day, sitting in the yard, my father said the strangest things. One of the mysterious yet wonderful things about hunger is it only kills men. He sounded mad, but it was true. Men were the ones going out foraging, and in return, burning precious energy that couldn't be restored. Cholera didn't discriminate, but hunger seemed to take only the men. Lots of men were also abandoning their families and leaving them to fend for themselves. In the mornings, they'd tell their wives they were going to go look for food and never come home. The pressure of providing for a wife and children was just too much to bear. Widows and the forsaken now gathered at the chief's house by the dozens. I hadn't seen Gilbert for days because he was so busy helping care for them. My father must have been thinking about this because he turned to my father and said, My family is mine to look after. If we're supposed to die, then we die together. These are my principles. God is on my side. A week later, my sister Maylus became sick with malaria. For days she lay on her reed mat, sweating and shivering in her sleep, then waking up to vomit. She couldn't keep down any food, and like the rest of us, she was already dangerously thin. At night, she'd cry and moan from the pain in her arms and legs. Her fevers became so violent my parents tried admitting her to the clinic, but the doctors refused because it was a quarantine for cholera. At home, my mother stayed up for hours by her bedside, singing traditional songs and soothing her with a wet cloth. A kerosene lamp flickered inside the room. All night we heard the same words coming through the darkened doorway. Don't worry, don't worry. But everyone was worried. Pray for your sister, my mother said. She's very sick. When Malis finally recovered, she was so thin she was like a ghost walking among us. Around mid-February, the tobacco was finally ready to prune, and my father needed me and Geoffrey to help. We gathered the yellow, oily leaves into fisted bundles. Then, sitting in the shade, we threaded the stem of every leaf with a crocheted needle and a mulu vine. The bundles were hung to dry under the shelters made from the blue gum and bamboo poles, a process that could take as long as 8 weeks, depending on the humidity. Threading and hanging took hours and killed our backs, especially because we had no energy to stand or hold ourselves up. In our delirium, the rows of drying tobacco began to look like delicious food. I wish we could eat it, I said to Geoffrey. Yeah, by now we'd be full. Soon it will be dried, and the treaters will line up to buy it. Finally, end this sadness. Yeah, for sure. But that's not what happened. Only a week after hanging the tobacco, my father went to the trading center and started cutting deals against the crop once it was dry. He couldn't wait for the auction. He had to find our supper. Brothers, my family is placing all their hopes on me, my father said. I'm asking you to give me a quality price, perhaps 20 kwacha a kilo. A full Walkman costs 30. The traders just shook their heads. You know times are tough, they said. I can't see myself giving more than 10 kwacha a kilo, not during this time. Please, just enough for a Walkman, my father said. Don't make me beg. This is quality tobacco. It's drying very nicely. After some time, they agreed to 15. As the famine deepened, these deals became more sour and unjust. I'll give you 1 bucket of maize for 90 kilos of that tobacco when it's ready, traders started saying. Even Mr. Mangochi, my father's friend, couldn't resist the market, and my father had no choice but to accept. Each week, he cut more deals against the crop, intending to keep the numbers straight in his head. Many men would have fought to the death to even have such an opportunity. Meanwhile, out in the maize fields, the stalks were now as high as my father's chest. The first ears had begun to form, revealing traces of reddish silk on their heads. The deep green leaves had begun their fade to yellow, along with the stem. While men withered and died all around, our plants were looking strong and fat. 20 days, I said, looking at my father. I'd say you're right. We smiled and stroked the leaves like swaddled babes, enjoying the soft music they created together in the breeze. If I was correct, we had 20 days until the green maize was mature enough to eat, something we lovingly called doway. It's the same as American corn on the cob, when the kernels are soft and sweet and so heavenly in your mouth. Standing in those fields in February, I felt like one of the old explorers I'd read about, lost in the ocean and dying of thirst. Water everywhere, not a drop to drink. All day and night I dreamed of Doway. Towards the end of the month, Radio 1 said the Doway was ready in Machinje, about 120 kilometers southwest. People started traveling there by the hundreds, including my Uncle Ari, my mother's brother. Along the way, he saw older men stop alongside the road and wave to family members, saying, Go ahead, get to Machinje. He later heard those men had died. Gangs with speared and pangas guarded the fields and harassed those coming from other districts. Theft was rampant, and while my uncle waited outside Machinje for his few kilos, he heard a great commotion on the outskirts of the village and rushed over to see. A mob had just attacked a thief and killed him. My uncle saw the man's body lying in the weeds, his neck cut to the bone. After nearly 5 months of suffering, on February 27th, the radio sent a message from our president. He was letting us know that the country was experiencing a hunger crisis. After consulting with his officials, he finally concluded it was an emergency. As I said, our president was a funny guy. At the beginning of March, the maize stalks were as high as my father's shoulders. At this stage, the flowers told you everything. Once the red and yellow silk began to dry and turn brown, you could start checking to see if the doway was ready. I pinched the cob very hard to feel the grain. If they crushed under your fingers, it was too early, but if the kernels were firm, you knew it was time. Every day that week, Geoffrey and I left the tobacco fields to check the doway, making sure to always use secret codes. God forbid my sisters followed and discovered that it was ready. Geoffrey, I said, let's go burn the wasps. Yeah, the wasps. Walking up and down the rows, we pointed out cobs that looked nearly done. Look at this one, I said. In 3 days it'll be in my mouth. Let's get the firewood today. Can we do this? I think we can. Then finally, I spotted a cob that appeared ready. I pressed my fingers against its grain. It was firm. It's ready, I said. Yes, it is, said Geoffrey, feeling another, and so is this one. That means our long-awaited day had finally arrived. For sure. Let's proceed. I ran through the roads, pulling the ripe doway, gripping them lovingly in my hands. Soon I had 15 ears spilling over in my arms. I peeled back the first layers of husk and tied them together, then draped them in a chain across my shoulders. Passing the tobacco shelter, I grabbed the armful of sticks we'd set out aside for the fire. The sight of Geoffrey and me running to the compound with necklaces of doway nearly started a riot. It's ready? My sister Aisha asked, eyes wide and excited. It's ready. Doway is ready! I ran into the kitchen and quickly made a fire. White smoke soon filled the room and burned my eyes, filling them with tears. But I didn't care. I was too excited. My sisters now crowded into the tiny kitchen, fighting for space. Let me see. No, I was here. You wait. All of you, go outside, I shouted. There's enough doway for all. I didn't wait for the fire to die into embers. I placed several cobs directly on the flames, flipping them until the fields were brown and blackened just right. I didn't even wait until the other side was finished cooking. I pulled the cob off the fire, so hot it scalded my fingers. Then I peeled back the steaming husks and began to eat. The kernels were meaty and warm and filled with the essence of God. I chewed slowly, and with great satisfaction, knowing I'd waited for so very long. Each time I swallowed was like returning something that was lost, some missing part of my being. When one side was eaten, I tossed the other back into the fire, moving into the next one. My parents now gathered in the kitchen as I prepared the steaming food. I don't think this doway is ready, my father said, snatching one quickly. Let me have a taste. He ripped off the silk and bit into the doway, savoring it as I had. Within seconds, the blood of life seemed to rush back to his face. He knew we would live. It's ready, he said. That afternoon, Geoffrey and I probably ate 30 ears of maize. As if heaven were coming down, the first pumpkins in our fields were also ready. For weeks, I'd watched them closely, waiting for them to grow into the right shape and color. Now, after all that time, here they were, as big as a man's head and orange as the morning sun. We cut them open and boiled them in a pot, seeds, skin, and all. My mother filled a basket with heaps of the warm, steaming meat, and we devoured them right there. My God, to have a stomach filled with hot food was one of the greatest pleasures in life. Even Geoffrey came over and ate our pumpkins and doway. Soon the swelling in his legs went away, and he began to smile like his own self. For me and Geoffrey, March was one big celebration. Each morning before working in the fields, we picked a handful of doway and made a fire beneath the tobacco shelter and ate a hearty breakfast. Mr. Geoffrey, this is mine, and this is yours. Sure, sure, give me mine. I remembered a parable that Jesus told the disciples, the one about the sower of seeds. The seeds sown along the path get snatched away and damaged. Those sown on rocky soil take no root and die, and those sown in the thorns get choked by the barbs. But the seeds sown on fertile soil will live and thrive. Mr. Geoffrey, we are like the seeds planted on fertile soil, not on the roadside, stepped on by those walking past. No, no, we lived. That's right, Mr. Geoffrey. We lived. We survived. The baskets of doway and steaming pumpkins were like a great army marching to save us from certain defeat. In the trading center, people began to smile and talk about the future now. Life wouldn't really return to normal until after we harvested, and at home the usual blob of Sema still greeted us each night at supper. But at least it was the start of something good. I started taking long walks to see how Malawi was doing, to see who survived and how they were getting along. With Doway now ready in the fields, people everywhere were drying it in their yards and making chitibu, chitibu, which is a sweeter kind of sema. People were regaining their strength, and smiling faces now greeted me along the roads. The same people who'd wandered weak and feeble now headed home, carrying children on their backs and great bundles on their heads. But with the famine still fresh on my mind, I expected them to ask the same question I'd been hearing from every stranger for months. Ganyu, I'm looking for Ganyu. Instead, it was our normal happy greeting. Mulibwanji, how are you? Nidre buinu kaya inu, fine, and you? Nidre buinu, fine. Zikomo, thanks for asking. Zikomo, no thank you. At the trading center, people now walked around shaking hands with their neighbors, as if they'd all returned from a long, hard journey. Good to see you, friend, they said. You're still around. I'm around. How did you manage yourself? God was on my side. The blessing of Doway allowed us to return to our lives, but it also brought thieves. Many farmers who traveled to Wimbe from other districts weren't benefiting from the Doway and the pumpkins because they didn't have their own fields. So instead, they took from others. The people living in Gilbert's Blue Gum Grove waited until it rained right, then stole the ripe doway. After 2 weeks of this, most of their fields were gone. The same thing happened to us. Each morning we walked the road that bordered our field and found it littered with green leaves and doway gnawed to the pith, as if a battalion had feasted all night. Horrible stories of revenge soon began circulating in the trading center. One day I heard some boys talking about the crimes. I heard some farmers in Kinji caught some men in their fields, one boy said. You know what they did? Took pingas and chopped off their arms, asking long sleeves or short sleeves. No. My cousin caught a young boy stealing his doway, said Gilbert. Put a metal pole in the fire until it became red hot, then told the boy to grab it. He did. All this talk about revenge made me wonder about our own fields. Later that night, I asked my father how we should punish those who stole from us. Should we kill them? I asked. Perhaps call the police? My father shook his head. We're not killing anyone, he said. Even if I call the police, those men would only starve to death in jail. Everyone has the same hunger, son. We must learn to forgive.